practice of miniaturization has been a fundamental component of magical practice from the earliest days. And I give you an example from Egypt where you have for instance, the funeral ritual enacted in the tomb is also depicted on the walls. Okay. And then it comes to be depicted on papyrus for the people who can't afford a retinue and a private tomb. And from a papyrus, it gets miniaturized again and again. And it finally shows up. The opening of the mouth ritual, which was central to this process, shows up in the Greek magical papyrus as a way of blessing and consecrating a brooch, for instance, or a magical ring. So the entire history of magic is kind of predicated on your ability to miniaturize larger scale processes down and down. And this gives us the missing key as to why it is that the tarot was chosen as a vehicle for the miniaturization of a radical metaphysics and a set of theurgical ritual practices, respectively, in the Tarot de Marseille and the Sola Busca.
Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead.
My guests today are two fantastic authors, philosophers, and scholars who came on the podcast to discuss their recent work together, published by Scarlet Imprint, Two Esoteric Tarots, which looks at the relationships between the Saturnian Sola Busca Tarocchi and the luminous Tarot de Marseille, both of which were created around the same time, and which are both incredibly complex and powerful early works in the history of the tarot. This is Christophe's first appearance as a guest on the podcast, and he is an art historian, philosopher, artist, and author with decades of experience in his fields of research. He's an expert on the intersections of Platonic mythology, the art and culture of the Renaissance, and the works of Marsilio Ficino, the philosopher, mage, and first translator of Plato's complete works. Peter Mark Adams is, of course, a returning guest and a friend of the show that I am so happy to welcome back and to speak with anytime I get the chance. He's an author, poet, and essayist specializing in the ethnography and visuality of ritual and sacred landscapes, and his many works include Mistai, Dancing Out the Mysteries of Dionysus, The Game of Saturn, Decoding the Sola Busca Tarocchi, and The Power of the Healing Field, among many others. This conversation was fascinating, delving into the history and mysticism of the two tarot decks and the role of myth in art and cultural history, animism in the Renaissance, and much more. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. In other news, I am happy to announce that I'll be presenting a workshop in person at the second annual Plant Cunning Conference in New York State this summer. Details of that will be in the show notes, and I'll be speaking about it in a future episode. It's a truly beautiful place and a beautiful event, and I am really excited to be a part of it. I'll also be presenting online coming up as part of the second Esotericism Outreach event, an online workshop which will be happening on the 24th of July, and there will be online event sign-up information also in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, as usual, please share it with your friends, leave us a good review, and find me on Instagram at Coffee and Divination. Enjoy the show. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome here today Peter Mark Adams, who's a friend of the show, who's been on several times, and Christophe Poncet, who is an incredible expert whose writings I deeply enjoy, and I am honored to have him on the show for the first time. So these two lovely gentlemen are here to discuss their most recent work for Scarlet Imprint, which is on the two esoteric tarots, which they are both experts in, the Tarot de Marseille and the Sola Busca Tarocchi. And those two giant works are obviously worthy of, years of study and many, many, many hours of interview questions in and of themselves. But in this work, you both sat down to have a conversation together, which we are now going to have in another form on this podcast. So I was wondering if you could each first give a little
intro of what drew you to tarot originally, and then more specifically, what drew you into the conversation with those older historical works, the Sola Busca and the Marseille, respectively. Whichever order you would like to answer.
Please, Christophe. I'll let you break the ice.
Thank you, Joanna, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. And okay, so to answer your question, my first encounter with the tarot was when I was 19. On my 19th birthday, I was offered by my girlfriend at that time a Tarot de Marseille deck. And before that, I already had practiced divination with ordinary card. But then with the discovery of that deck, I was absolutely amazed because these images, they seem to carry such a universe of meanings and significations. If we compare them to an ordinary pack of cards, it was just fantastic. So I got into it, and little by little, I started studying the cards, because at that time, I had read some books like how-tos, manuals to teach you how to tell the tarot. But what I read was almost nonsensical, because it was just, it seemed arbitrary. And so I started studying the cards myself. There was a little booklet including with my deck, and this little booklet gave that kind of method. It advised the tarot reader to study the cards himself and to compare the details and to try to make sense of his own about all this. And that's how I started. And well, many years later, this brought me to make certain discoveries, and that led finally to this book with Peter and other books with Scarlet Imprint. But this is a very long story. Anyway, at some point, after I had been studying the cards themselves for a long time, I realized that it needed to be historicized and contextualized. At that time, there was no absolute certitudes about when the Tarot de Marseille deck had been, there still isn't, however, when it had been created and in what context. I had the idea at some point that the history of the costumes would help me identifying the place and time when this deck was created. And so I studied the costumes, how the characters were dressed and what they looked like. And I had the feeling that these images all related to Italy, rather northern part of Italy, and in the end of the 15th century, and even at some point, I made precise comparisons with precise figures. It was not just, oh, the costume is the same as that costume in that work of art of 1520 or 1470. It was that work of art, an etching, for example, or a fresco that really seemed to have inspired the tarot image. And so now I had a lead that was much more strong, and I could finally date the whole deck to around 1475, and precisely from Florence, Tuscany. I was amazed to have reached that point in identifying the origins of the tarot deck. But it was not the only thing that helped me in identifying the true origins of the deck. At that time, I was also reading Plato. And for some reason, I was reading Plato. I had fallen in love with Plato after reading the Symposium. Not so much for the philosophy of Plato, I must say, but rather for the literary qualities of his writing. I loved that. So I started reading the dialogues, starting from the beginning and carrying on all the way. And while I was reading, all the time, I kept thinking to myself, oh, wow, this image Plato is talking about really looks like the images in the Tarot de Marseille deck. And it happened many, many, many times. And I was putting notes in my Plato edition every time I met such correspondences. And finally, I thought to myself, but why is that so Plato images appear in the Tarot de Marseille deck? I remember I was particularly struck because it's very spectacular by the Chariot of the Soul. You know this myth where you have a charioteer with a chariot with two horses, and there's one horse going up and the other is going down, and so it's very complicated for the driver to drive his chariot. And this is an image of the human soul who's attracted by base matter, and at the same time also has spiritual aspirations, to simplify. Anyway, this appears to be almost exactly represented in the chariot of the Tarot de Marseille. And so I tried to find out why these Platonic images reappeared in Florence in 1475. And that's how I met a figure of the Medicean court at that time. It's Florence at that time is ruled by the Medici, and Cosimo first, and then Piero, and then Lorenzo il Magnifico. And this man, whom I'm talking about, Marsilio Ficino, is the philosopher of Cosimo and of all the Medici, Cosimo first and then Lorenzo. And Cosimo assigned him with the task of translating Plato. And it's the first time since antiquity that the whole of Plato, there had been some little translations here and there, but the whole of Plato is the very first time that it's translated from the Greek to Latin. And so it's an enormous event. It's a bomb. The philosophy of the time was rather Aristotelian, so categories and rationality, logic, and it was a little dry. Then the reappearance of Plato makes it more mystic, and it gives more spirit to that. And so, having found out this character, I started investigating his works, and so I realized that it was not so much Plato's images that were represented in the Tarot de Marseille cards, but Plato's images reinterpreted in the eyes of Marsilio Ficino, who was a Christian and who had to face a strong opposition from the dominant scholars who were all Aristotelians and who frowned upon the Platonic philosophy. And it was really despised and considered, this homosexuality, also the theory of the ideas that seemed to be contradicting the Christian dogma. And so that's how I formed the hypothesis that probably Ficino, at some point in his huge, immense task of translating this work of Plato, thought that he needed some playful way of communicating this very complex and disputed corpus, and he thought of adapting a game of cards that already existed, the tarot, to make it pedagogical game, like something for initiatory game, and so that's, to sum up, what I've been about for all these.
To sum up decades of work.
Yeah.
But no, I appreciate that introduction to it. So, Peter, what do you want to? I mean, you have been on the show to discuss the Sola Busca in detail in another episode. But for those who may not have heard it, can you tell us a little bit of your intro to tarot and your entrance to that world?
Yeah, I encountered it along with my other esoteric studies in early teens. And in those years, the so-called Rider-Waite deck, it's actually the Coleman Rider-Waite deck, was kind of everywhere all of a sudden. It must have been a new print. And alongside that was the Thoth Tarot of Crawley. So I picked up the Pamela Coleman Waite deck, and that became my principal study. I mean, I was kind of overwhelmed with the iconography of the deck, I have to say, at that age. And it was just so impactful that it fairly beckons you on a path of discovery. And there were some early texts around which helped you to begin to provide a metaphysical context for understanding the cards. So, I got started on that very early on. And then I became aware of the Thoth deck. And that was of another order because it was almost incomprehensible to me at that age. And in that time when Crawley's works were very difficult to find. And it's such a densely textured design. But again, it has this presence about it. So I had the two tarot decks going on in parallel for a long time. And then off and on over the decades, I respectively studied and sometimes read professionally. And this went on for, I know, a certain number of decades before I became even aware that the Sola Busca existed. It was, if tarot is a fairly arcane pursuit, Sola Busca is the arcanum of the tarot studies. It's so obscure. But I kind of accidentally stumbled upon it. And of course, I couldn't understand how it was that after studying tarot for so many decades, I couldn't make head or tail of the iconographic program that was being pursued in the Sola Busca. It made no sense to me whatsoever. And yet I couldn't deny the fact that this was a Renaissance masterwork. There had evidently been enormous resources and artistic skill employed, both in its design and execution. And yet it only existed, apparently, in one printed and painted copy. So there's like an accumulation of enigmas. And I can say that, I started studying Sola Busca, I think it was around 2013. And we published The Game of Saturn in 2017. So it was like 4 years, day and night study. And here I am in 2024, and I still find the deck enigmatic in certain essential features, in its positioning within the time, within that society, within that culture. I still find the deck wholly enigmatic in certain respects.
Yes, and while they have an interesting amount in common. Obviously, the Tarot de Marseille and the Sola Busca, even though one is clearly, I mean, as I'm sure the people who are listening here may have heard of or may own a Marseille deck, Sola Busca is more specialized as a field of knowledge. Let's put it that way. As Peter, I know you would agree. And outside of the work that you've done it and a few other kind of academic works, there really isn't that same kind of ingrained relationship that people in the esoteric world may have with the Sola Busca as they do with the Marseille, even though they come from very similar time periods. We've already touched on the fact, Christophe has touched on the fact that the influence of Platonic ideas and Hellenistic ideas was really present in the culture of Italy at that time, even though it's still not completely, there's still discussion over when exactly they were both created exactly. You both have come to the conclusion that the two decks that we're discussing today were created within, I think it's within essentially like a 10-year time frame of each other, which is incredibly close. In that sense, the world of that Hellenistic tradition growing up around, the time that this was created is very important. We've touched on Ficino, but then there's also the Platonist Plethon, who was visiting Italy at that time. Perhaps, Peter, could you just remind people of who he is and why he's also important to this Platonic discussion?
Yeah. To backpedal a little bit, the influx of these primary texts from the Byzantine Empire to Italy started to occur in the 1420s and 1430s. Okay, so Giovanni Aurispa brought the complete works of Plato, Proclus, Plotinus, and most of Iamblichus to Italy when he returned from studying in Constantinople. But of course, these were Greek manuscripts. So their circulation was quite limited. But in 1438, 1439, the world, the age's greatest authority on Plato, George Gemistus, visited Italy as part of the Byzantine delegation. It was a delegation to attempt to unify the Eastern and Western churches. But within the delegation, George Gemistus, who was the political advisor to the Byzantine emperor and his son, was also curiously a dedicated pagan, a Hellenist through and through, and not only that, actively proselytized a resumption of Hellenistic paganism. And for this purpose, he had developed a complete liturgy, a complete pagan liturgy, with hymns, music, and incorporated within that a entire gestural repertoire, which could only have been inherited from the traditions of late antiquity. So this kind of bundle arrived in Ferrara and Florence, 1438, 1439, and Gemistus Platon gets up and starts giving lectures on the superiority of Plato to Aristotle. And there were very, very few people with the academic grasp of these subjects to argue with him. And in essence, as Christophe indicated, the bombshell was this, that the medieval church rested upon certain metaphysical principles which acted as levers of control. Principally, the notion that the soul was created upon conception and upon death was judged and then either allocated to heaven or hell for all eternity. And the only way to, so to speak, offset life's sins was to obey the church and follow her rites. Now, in opposition to that, Platon brought a pure Platonism which stated the soul is eternal, transverses many lives, and through its own action in terms of self-purification and service can raise itself towards assimilation towards the gods. And that's to say a theurgic union or henesis. And this is such a powerful message of spiritual independence and a kind of transcendence, I would have to say, which can be self-managed, which doesn't rely upon the church, its hierarchy, or its authority, which it, of course, fatally undermines. So this bombshell went off at the very heart of Renaissance culture and triggered what I call the second Renaissance, the Hellenistic Renaissance. So we have an early Renaissance in which the recovery of the Latin classical inheritance occurred, and it's associated with people like Petrarch, and this was complete by 1430, 1440 or so. But all of a sudden then, with 1438, 1439, and then moving forward with the translation of these core texts into Latin, as Christophe indicated, we have the triggering of a second Renaissance, which is a Hellenistic one. And essentially, underlying it is this notion of spiritual independence and autonomy, which is so radical in the context of the medieval church, it fatally undermines its authority. And so what I think we're saying, and Christophe will correct me on this, is that the two tarot decks, and I want to say another word here because this is often overlooked, the practice of miniaturization has been a fundamental component of magical practice from the earliest days. And I give you an example from Egypt where you have the, for instance, the funeral ritual enacted in the tomb is also depicted on the walls, okay? And then it comes to be depicted on papyrus for the people who can't afford a retinue and a private tomb. And from a papyrus, it gets miniaturized again and again. And it finally shows up, the opening of the mouth ritual, which was central to this process, shows up in the Greek magical papyrus as a way of blessing and consecrating a brooch, for instance, or a magical ring. So the entire history of magic is kind of predicated on your ability to miniaturize larger scale processes down and down. And this gives us the missing key as to why it is that the tarot was chosen as a vehicle for the miniaturization of a radical metaphysics and a set of theurgical ritual practices, respectively, in the Tarot de Marseille and the Sola Busca. So I just throw that in. Now, what was your question again, Joanna? I totally lost track.
No, you've answered it because I was just asking about. Don't worry about my question. That's all good. Oh, okay. And now that has thrown off what my next question was. No, let's see. No, so I think that's very true. So that process of miniaturization, which goes throughout magical history, is also kind of intrinsically aligned with how we view what images are for, like what this art is for. And I find it interesting how academia, you've both commented in various ways about how academia has been very allergic to wanting to really consider any esoteric meanings to tarot before the 18th century, which I find really kind of funny, because in normal, like even in like art history studies and things of that nature, they will consider it, and they will talk about how magical the worldview of the people who were creating the art were. But sort of in this one category, then it's okay to discuss, yes, well, of course, astrological symbolism may play a role in how something is depicted in an artwork, but not over here. No, this is completely rational and just a game. I could kind of ask two different questions from that of why do you think academia has such an allergy to it? But more specifically, I think it's more important for people to understand that the worldview of the people in that, let's say we're talking 15th century Italy, was quite magical. And that magical worldview, that understanding that symbolism in art could imbue things with a lot of different layers of meaning, was very much there. Could each of you kind of maybe speak to a little bit of some examples of how those symbols show up, that you have found in the artwork? That's possibly a little vague, but I'm sure you can go with that.
That's fine. That's fine. Who wants to go first? Christophe? No?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. I want to come back here to an absolutely pivotal moment in human history. I consider the human race to have been largely animist for most of the past 35,000 years. Okay, so from the Upper Paleolithic until probably the 17th century or the 18th century, we had a largely animist outlook. That's to say, we assign personhood to non-human and even physical objects. And the two principal forms of that was totemism and analogism. I'm referencing the work here of Philip de Scola, Beyond Nature and Cultures, classic work on the ethnography of this division. After the 17th century and with the Enlightenment, we have the rise of what I would call, or what he calls, naturalism, which is essentially the empiricist, materialist outlook that characterizes modernity. So modernity's huge problem is accounting for the fact that all preceding human culture embodied a much broader notion of personhood and embodiment than itself. Okay. And the only way it could explain it is through concepts such as it's the primitive. It was an undeveloped, rather than an alternative path of development. So the tarot very much, certainly the 15th century, was an animist culture. Totemism is the assignment of an effective power based on similar qualities amongst materials and objects, people. And analogism is the assignment of power because it's a miniaturization of a larger process that may be the action of deities that then becomes ritualized and then miniaturized success. So the two arms of totemism and analogism provide us with the framework for understanding the 15th century's view of art. And it's fundamentally in opposition to a naturalist, modernist perspective. Okay. And that's the problem. It's a problem of translation, the fact that modernism is not willing to attribute sense to another path of development, perception, and relationships. So I know that's all a bit abstract, I know. So we can look at how that finds it's embodied within these two decks of cards, of course.
Mm-hmm. And then that also goes into what these two decks were kind of created for, because then I think that can give some more specifics to that. But I want to hear Christophe's thoughts before I go in that direction.
Yeah, no, I agree with Peter. It's largely a matter of power. The question is really, are these images powerful? Do they produce something? Can they act on the world? Can they have an effect? Are they performative? And of course, in a modernist view, they cannot. The power is reserved to the images of those who detain the power, the actual power, the power of the armies, the power of the law, the power. But such popular instruments cannot detain any power. Be it an imaginary power, they have to be devoid of any actual effect on people. And so it's almost unbelievable to see how scientists, scholars, academics who are trained in logic and have all books available and have all knowledge and very rich libraries just deny anything of the sort, despite the fact that we now, and we already had, thousands of evidence material and also mostly logical. It's almost irrational. We observe the same thing in the fields of art. History of art nowadays largely tends to consider the aesthetic aspect, tendencies, rather than the potency of the works of art themselves. But it's also true in the field of philosophy. For example, Plato, just to name one, because it's the one I know best. Plato nowadays is considered a rationalist almost. He is pure logic, and the Platonists today, the specialists of Plato in the academy, don't want to consider the idea that Plato was also a mystic and that spirituality is immense in his writings, and that many of the most important things that he wrote do not deduce themselves logically, but for example, to name the symposium, come from the mouth of an inspired prophetess, Diotima, and it comes out of her voice, and it comes from the sky, and there's no logical explanation about this. And the most important things in Plato are like that, but nowadays the specialists of Plato just want to see in him the logical thinker that you could find in every university of the Western world. So,
yeah, no, that's absolutely true. That the potency within it, the power within it, which isn't considered, it has to be kept to the side. From a more materialist standpoint, as a violinist, so I have a violin that is several hundred years old, and you have to get it reevaluated, for insurance purposes every few years. And the first time I had to do this with my instrument was at Sotheby's, and so I went to the expert and got it out of its case. And before the guy had a chance to do anything, I was getting ready to play the instrument, and he said, "Oh, no, I don't need to hear it." And I thought, "What?" And he was actually like, "Oh." Kind of like, it was very cute. He was like, no, we're just going to do measurements. He was like, I'm going to do very precise measurements of the instrument, and that's it. That's all that's used for insurance purposes. And I said, but isn't the sound of the instrument at all considered in its valuation? He said, no, I don't even need to hear if it makes any sound. that has nothing to do with its valuation, which now, of course, I know that. But when I was, first realizing that there's something about that where you're like, the potency, the power of this instrument is in its sound. And yet the only thing that was measured was literally just its infinitesimal measurements and any markings, and that's it.
Yeah.
So there is something in
that.
That's
incredible story, Joanna.
Even he was like, I know this doesn't make any sense, but this is literally how we value them.
Wow.
I was like, okay, I'll put it back in its case. But yeah, so there is something that
makes me think of a very prominent Platonic scholar who, as late as the 1950s, he was talking about theurgy as the last refuge of a despairing intelligentsia. And this is one of the key books of classical scholarship on the later Platonic tradition. So there's also a sense here of a kind of Enlightenment cultural superiority at work. I'm sorry to say, it's almost as though Europe reached a peak of refinement and sophistication and understanding, and everyone else is somewhere down below, historically and culturally. And it's very unfortunate, but I think we have to recognize that there is this kind of colonializing narrative at work here. It's often not explicit, but it's kind of implicit in the Enlightenment project.
Yeah, of breaking that down and taking it out as much as possible. But it never succeeds, though, thank goodness. So I think about what Camellia Elias says about just read what's on the damn cards, which I always kind of go back to. And I think that even when we're going into sort of necessarily the history of these cards and who created them and why and what philosophers were influencing them, there is still something to the nature of just looking at the cards. And what you have both done masterfully is obviously try to break down what is on those cards for people who are looking at them from a very different time period from when they were created, etc. So with that being said, it perhaps would be helpful to people when I release this, I'm going to put some images on the screen in order for people to be able to compare what these cards look like. There is a lot where you both go into the ways that characters are dressed. I mean, Christophe, you already mentioned how that the figurations helped you to a place where these cards were first created and what time period. But there's also the symbolic content to the importance of like what hats people or crowns people are wearing or what objects they're pointing to or holding. Those examples are no longer obvious to us. And perhaps even in the time period, they weren't meant to be obvious, a la this is esoteric knowledge. So it's meant to be for people who can wink back at the card and understand what they're being shown. Can you maybe give us an example of a card that includes some of those? I think in the book you mentioned you used the Fool a couple of times, and I particularly love that card both in the Marseille and in modern decks. So I would throw that out there as an idea, but perhaps there are others that you would want to consider. Whoever wants to go first.
Okay.
Please.
All you.
Okay, I'll start. The Fool is a very interesting card for both our decks because it's one of the very few that obviously resemble each other in the Sola Busca and in the Marseille. First, by the name, because it's named Matto in the Sola Busca, and it's named Mat in the Marseille. And very interestingly, it doesn't have a number in the Marseille, Tarot de Marseille, whereas it appears to have a 0 in the Sola Busca deck. So here we have a connection a very strong connection between the two decks, and it's both the name and the number or non-number that correspond in the two cards. That is fascinating. And if you look at the cards also, there is another point that strikes me very strongly. It's the presence of an object on the shoulder of both characters. And in the Tarot de Marseille, it's a bundle. The character is holding a bundle on his shoulder. And on the Sola Busca card, it was transformed into a bagpipe. And so it's just, and we have been discussing this very slightly in the book, but I think there is a lot of research to do in this way. It's that it seems that the two decks are in a conversation between themselves, as if, in my opinion, as if the Sola Busca designer, because I think the Sola Busca is a little later than the Marseille deck, as if the Sola Busca designer had observed, analyzed the Marseille card, and had thought, oh, how am I going to transform this to adapt it to my own conceptions, my own philosophy? And that's a point we've discussed a lot in the book, is, in fact, the two philosophies are almost opposite, and they cannot be more different. We have one philosophy of love, of light, of universality, and that's the one shown in the Tarot de Marseille. And we have another philosophy of raw power, of domination, of in a way of darkness and grossness also, and that's the philosophy of the Sola Busca. And we have shown, and that was the very interesting part of that conversation we had, Peter and I, when we had this talk that led to the book. It's to discover how amazingly they differed from one another, and at the same time how similar they were in their conception and in their context. I mean, Ferrara and Florence are very near from one another. There were two different courts and two different states, city-states, and they were sometimes allied and sometimes opposed, but there was a competition between them. And this competition can be seen in the two decks, and probably the two masterminds between the two decks were in some sort of conversation, distant conversation between one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with the notion of a conversation between the two iconographies, and it surfaces at certain points and disappears at other points. But one of the points, as you say, is the Fool or Matto, and the conception that the Sola Busca, the framing that the Sola Busca puts around that figure is kind of similar but unique in so many respects. It seems to be taking the medieval tradition of the Wodvos, the wild man, the green man. He has this wild hair. But he also has like a raven on his shoulder, which is kind of reminiscent of how the raven appears in the Mithraic mysteries. It's like you have a jumble of references there, not all of which are clear to me. The raven is a I think, a symbol of Apollo because it's gripping his flesh. And therefore, the fact that he's a kind of a musician, that he's in a distraught state, suggests to me the myth of Apollo and the nature spirit that he competed with for a musical performance. And of course, the last person you should compete with is a deity. Of course, he loses and it pulls him out of his skin. And again, although the Sola Busca has this conversation going with the Tarot de Marseille iconography, it then takes it off into a very grotesque arena of realization. And this is something which is peculiarly characteristic only of the Sola Busca. It's kind of ingrained and systematic deployment of a grotesque aesthetic. It's quite unique, I think, in art history. I can't think of another one like it, although the grotesque features in European iconography for centuries. But it often has a humorous kind of connotation to it. The grotesqueries that illustrate the marginalia of prayer books and Bibles, for instance, they're often a bit ribald or political, but they're all humorous. But here in the Sola Busca, there's no trace of humor. It's like there's something very, I don't know what, disturbing about it. It's almost as though the iconographic surface, the aesthetic, has been designed to deflect attention from itself. Although it's rendered with high values of Renaissance draftsmanship, it kind of throws people away from itself in its grotesqueries. Sorry, Joanna, you're going to...
No, it's interesting because so it dual purpose then, because it could be to sort of throw people who are not quite how I mean to say it, but throw people that are not meant to understand it or not within an inner circle that would have understood some of what it's symbolically saying. It would cause them to not even really want to examine it because it's grotesque. So why would I want to really examine that? It's not funny. It's not entertaining. It's not beautiful to look at. Some of the images are quite disturbing.
Wouldn't make a good wedding present, for instance.
No. No. And yet at the same time, it's also that the purpose of it, and this, we kind of touched on this more in the discussion that you and I had specifically on this deck, but that it is much more Saturnian and much more chthonic and clearly aimed at like at least one or two purposes that are magical attempts at power, essentially. And therefore it does have kind of an edge to it, which is, I think, what Christophe was already, sort of touching on, the light versus the dark aspects of the tarot that are present in one versus the other when you look at them, even though they were made in what seems to be a dialogue of a very short time period as well between the peoples who were making them.
I think a lot of people have a problem with the fact that I attribute the core ideas to Platon, who is often considered a saintly figure. And they have a problem with connecting that saintliness with the darkness or the power-related aspects of the Sola Busca. But I would point out to people that both Byzantium and subsequently Ferrara were at risk of military collapse. And that as a political advisor, Platon was saying we must revert to paganism. We must fall back on the power of the ancient gods. And he used a metaphor to the Byzantine emperor, actually, that you need to sometimes cut an arm off for the body to survive. Okay, so the times in which these people lived and endured, Platon in respect of the imminent fall of Constantinople and the entire Hellenistic cultural, so to speak, ecumen, and Ferrara invaded by Venice and 30% of its territory lost, its economy trashed, and in a kind of desperate struggle to reboot itself, essentially. So that what I see in Sola Busca is the response in extremis, which didn't come to Florence because, of course, it was a banking nation. It had a sounder financial base. It was less involved in the internecine wars of both Europe and the Italian peninsula. Whereas Ferrara had to mount an army every single season to make its income, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense in which circumstances also shape our spiritual perspective. And mm-hmm. we need to take this on board as well, because too often we shape our spiritual concepts in relative peace and security. And that's simply not the experience of large parts of the world even today.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that's also interesting that you bring up Apollo, just because people have the conception, at least I think a lot of modern day people have a conception of Apollo that is very, I mean, he is obviously Apollonian, has that meaning, but it's very Olympian and very light and very associated with those kinds of concepts that are maybe a little bit elevated, shall we say. But Apollo also has a very dark aspect to him in other forms and in the pagan past, and a lot of association with death and sudden death, and quite a bit of what might be considered Masonic. Well.
Yeah. And the plague, he was closely associated with plague and protection from plague, which was decimating people at different periods of history. Mm-hmm. It was an ever-present feature of European life until the 17th or 18th century, which we tend to forget.
Before I move on, Christophe, do you have anything you want to add there before I ask another question?
No, I agree, and that's fine.
So when we're looking at the creation of these two decks, the ways in which they both kind of entered history and modern usage went in very, very different directions. The Tarot de Marseille, like I've mentioned, people may have a deck at home that they work with that is the Marseille deck. The Sola Busca, not so much, not so much at all, I think.
Not so much at all.
But is there anything that you think? Do you think that there is a magical reason why? And I guess this is more a question for you, Peter. Do you think that there is more of if there is a magical reason why Sola Busca is kind of coming back into the conception of today in the occult world? I mean, you obviously have been drawn to it and have done an enormous amount of work in order to allow people to have sort of this window into what it is and what it may have been created for. But then there's also sort of that like larger sense of why now as opposed to another time. And also I would say Marseille is clearly having a huge renaissance right now, where so many more people are being drawn to working with Marseille decks. Myself, I've been reading tarot since I was 12, and I only very recently started reading with Marseille. And it always seemed very difficult, and it sort of just sat there as a thing to do one day, but now it's become a part of my practice. Is there something that you could each touch on of why you think this renaissance of these two ideas is happening now?
Gosh, that's a really
huge question, I know.
Really tough question. Part of it is historical accident, I think. And part of it is the fact that Christophe and I have been kind of working separately, but in parallel lines to a certain extent. I don't know when you started the serious quest for the roots of the Tarot de Marseille tradition, Christophe, but certainly 2013, I was deeply engaged with the Sola Busca at that point. And that was in 1 or 2 years of the exhibition and catalogue that made images of it more widely accessible for the first time. So there's a kind of, in the Sola Busca's case, there's a kind of accidental or historical circumstance That said, when I started working on it, and I'm being quite open about this many times, I experienced massive influx of energy on several occasions of most overwhelming power. So that over the 4 years of researching and writing, it was like a total absorption in the task. I can't say much more to answer your question.
No, that's I appreciate that.
No.
Mm-hmm.
Regarding the Marseille, I must say that there has been a long evolution that started even before I started studying the tarot. The beginning of the 80s. I started studying the Tarot de Marseille beginning of the 80s. At that time, the decks that were available were not faithful to the tradition. It was in France mostly the Marteau deck, which had been transformed in the 30s, and the colors and the details were really transformed with respect to the tradition. But then publishers started publishing facsimiles of historical decks, and I can mention Yves Reynaud, who's doing a fantastic job restoring historical decks and publishing them for everyone to acquire. And this really changed everything. So now we had some material that could be used for historical research, which was not the case before. We just didn't have the tools to research seriously. So this happened, I would say, in the 90s. We started to have these decks available. And then working on these instruments, we could make the discoveries that were necessary to understand what it was about. To make the point that these images have to be deciphered in their very detail, because they have been conceived as mind games or puzzles. And so if you have an unfaithful image, you just can't work, because you don't get the point. And the point is very often hidden is in a very small detail. And if the copyist or the industrial company who made the subsequent deck doesn't get the point, it cannot reproduce it, and it will be forgotten forever. So this historical work had to be done before of printing faithful to the tradition decks. And there, I can think of strength. For example, we have this card of strength, and this is one thing that I was very amazed to discover one day. It's that it's an amorphosis. And when you put the card on a mirror and you bend the card a little, you see a monster appearing. And so these images were conceived to make their users think, and to make them think a lot to find out. It was a research they were invited to make for the initiatory purposes. And in the writings of Marsilio Ficino, very often you find hints to these clues that are to be found in the card. And there is, for example, in Ficino's commentary to the Timaeus, there is a passage, not very long, about 20, 30 lines, less than a page. And it's very strange passage because it's not related to what's before and it's not related to what's after. And it starts with a sentence talking about a triple septenary. So 3 times 7. And you don't see why he's talking about 3 times 7 there. And the passage ends with the mention again of a 3 times 7 structure. So we have these lines that are very well identified. And when you read it, it doesn't make any sense. There has been a translation in English of this passage by the translator of the commentary of the Timaeus in English, and it's just senseless. It doesn't mean anything. But when you rework the translation and using double entendre meanings, I mean, words, you have to pick up not the obvious meaning, not the first one in the dictionary, not the first entry, but the second or maybe the last one. And then the text transforms and you discover that Ficino had been describing the structure of the Tarot de Marseille. And it's just an amazement. Once you have discovered all these details, and once you have realized that these images are not flat images as we have today, you have the picture of that thing, that object, that event, that person, but that you have mind games and you have to dig into it and you have to follow the clues and you have to rewrite the process reading it. Then you realize that for a combinatory art as tarot readings, there's a wealth of meanings that can be used here and there. And the process of reading the cards is a totally different experience. You are no longer associating one card and one meaning, or a couple of cards with one meaning. No, it becomes much and much richer. And once you've discovered it, you cannot read the cards in the same way. It's just another experience. And I think now people are starting to understand it. And of course, there have also been literary experiences, and it's a literary process. I'm thinking about, I forgot his name, never mind. It's poetry.
We're very much looking forward to your forthcoming work, Christophe, so that we can experience this for ourselves.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Can I ask you, is there any other example of anamorphism that you found within the Tarot de Marseille? Just the one, or?
This one? No. Anamorphosis, it's the only one.
Okay, that's so interesting.
Ficino, I mean, the cards have different ways to convey meanings. There are other details that are meaningful in other ways. It's mind games of various sorts, and it can be games on words. It can be hints. It can be literary allusions. For example, if we go back to the Fool, which in French is le mat. Here we have a word game. Le mat, or il matto in Italian, has two etymologies. One is the one you find in the chess term checkmate. Checkmate, it's the king is dead. Cha, the king, mat is dead. So it gives the idea of death. The second etymology of mat is from matus. So it's not from the Arabic this time, or for the Persian, but from the Latin, and it's matus. Matus is when you have a hangover and you feel desperate in the morning after having drunken too much, and you feel very bad, and you can't think correctly, and so you're dizzy, and you're matus. And that's what we find in the cards. Mat is at the same time dizzy, crazy, ill at ease, and it's the craziness that you find in the gestures hat and the bells, and in that way he is matus. But then, as we said, it has no number. But there is another card in the Tarot de Marseille who has a number but not a name. And if you look at them together, you can see that they can be superimposed, and the silhouette of the character are almost the same. And it's like one displaying a skeleton, showing a skeleton being like the X-ray version of the other. And so you have death on one side, and it's the skeleton, and it has a number and no name. And then you have the other who has no number and who has a name, but a name that has two meanings. And these two meanings can be replicated on the two cards. And that is the kind of games you are invited to discover when you study the Tarot de Marseille.
Yes, and that I feel like that also ties into the complexity of the work that you have to do in order to make sense of this involves like the knowledge of it's essentially it's art history, but it's also more than that. It's iconographic history, it's ritual history, it's so many different fields, and that's what complicates all this, right? Because it's literary history and art history and cultural history, historical history that all has to go into informing an analysis of what is on the cards. Just read what's on the damn cards. Difficult, easy to say, sometimes very difficult to do. And then I'm sure that you would both agree that there's probably some allusions that we haven't uncovered and we may never. I mean, for myself, I love studying Shakespeare as well. And the number of times where I have been reading and they'll say, and the allusion to what he meant by this, or he was clearly alluding to something that the audience would have known, and we have no idea what it is. But here's a couple of theories. We'd have lost whatever the text was that he is referencing. And I'm sure that there are things that you are still uncovering through this, because there's elements of those many disparate historical fields that we don't have all the pieces. Is there anything in particular that is, I don't know, maybe the way I want to ask this question is, are there certain cards or certain parts of this that are still bothering you that you haven't been able to figure out? Or is there one in particular that you're still always kind of going back to wonder what that's about, or one that's your favorite that's a mystery in it? I always find those interesting.
Okay, shall I start?
Sure.
There are still, of course, many mysteries in the Tarot de Marseille. Maybe the most mysterious cards are the deepest ones, and they are the ones that probably seem the most simple. There is a series of cards, trump cards, in the Tarot de Marseille, whom I call the authorities. And there are the Pope, Popess, Empress, Emperor, and Justice. And when you look at them, well, they're just obvious. I mean, they are like like the magazines where you see the crowned heads and the kings and the queens and all that stuff. And so there's little to find out in them. And many times, very often, these cards are a little overlooked because you don't know what sense to make out of them. It's just symbols of power and purpose, feminine power, emperor power simply, and pope spiritual power maybe, and etc., etc. And you get those meanings, simple meanings that do not offer the richness you're expecting from a spiritual tarot like the Tarot de Marseille. But as a matter of fact, studying these cards, I stumbled upon a set of engravings, etchings of the same period, around 1470, that were made by a Florentine engraver, Baccio Baldini, and they represent the prophets and the sibyls. And it's very interesting because the sibyls are pagan and the prophets are Christian, biblical, biblical. And it corresponds to that conception that has been brought around by Ficino, that there was a harmony between the different traditions, and the Christian traditions was in harmony with a longer chain of philosophers, prophets, spiritual leaders, Zoroaster, Orpheus, Hermes Trismegistus, who were pagan. And so there is this association, and there is a unique truth, but this truth has been revealed in different ways throughout the centuries. And so we have this series, and it contains 36 images. And I realized that the trumps I told you about, the authorities, are all inspired by these engravings. And so this gives them another weight. They are no longer simply spiritual, leaders of their time, like kings and queens and etc., but they hold something stronger. All the more than when you see the writings that accompany these engravings, you realize that they not so much refer to actual prophets and sibyls, but rather to astrological decans. And that's how they were called by an art historian, the astrological sibyls. So there are not so much sibyls as astrological decans. And so they are, again, powerful images. So we have this series of 36 images of decans, who are powerful images, used for what kind of purpose? You have to guess, because we don't know, but certainly it was used in some interesting way, esoterical way, and it has been used to inspire the tarot cards I call authorities. And then you realize that these authorities cards make a subset of the trump cards, and that's another story, but they are related to a myth, a Platonic myth, that is the myth of her, who describes the great principles on top of which we have justice, ananke, divine justice, and her three daughters, the Parcae, the Fates, Cloto, Lachesis, and Atropos. And from there, studying Ficino's writings, you realize that these cards not so much show images of powerful people of that time, but they are the images of these great principles: divine justice, the parquet, and last but not least, the prophet, who attributes their swords to each of the souls that are to be to descend to the physical world. Nevertheless, given all that, they remain mysterious, because these great principles in themselves are great mysteries, and they will remain such mysteries.
Your reference to the decans is particularly interesting, Christophe, as they feature largely in Ferrara in the Palazzo Schifanoia, which was designed by Pellegrino Prisciani. And although that room is generally perceived to be a Renaissance masterwork, more than that, the distribution of the astrological images around the room, the decans principally, was connected with the flow of light through the room at different times of the year. Okay, so they actually designed the illumination of the room to, so to speak, interact with the imagery. And there's no question but the decans, of course, trace their roots back to the earliest strata of Egyptian magic. They are they're not connected to the astrological symbols. They are distinct deities in their own rights, and they were clearly an integral part of the practice of astral magic, which, of course, Ficino was a great proponent of, as was Pellegrino Prisciani, who I believe designed the Sola Busca. So we're on some very interesting. I'm very much looking forward to your book coming out.
Yes. I'm sure we all are.
Yeah.
No, sometimes it is, yeah, those
I was
those
going
largest
to
forces,
answer my part of that. I'm trying to think. The two cards which I find most anomalous within the Sola Busca are the 20 and 21. That's to say the Nimrod and Nebuchadnezzar. Their presence within that iconographic program is strange. And you mentioned how the motto of Sola Busca is 0, but you can also see it as a representation of Nebuchadnezzar after he went mad, when he crawled on the ground with leaves in his hair and everything. So that would make the Sola Busca a circle. So from 21, you return to 0. But I find it odd because Nimrod is a curious figure to select. And when I think of the associations, first of all, it's the first occurrence of the tower image in tarot iconography. I can't think of an earlier one. And it shows the tower struck by lightning. The normal source for this is given as Genesis in the Old Testament. But the Old Testament doesn't describe the tower as struck by lightning at all. It talks about a confusion of languages and dispersion of the workforce. So clearly the design has gone outside of the Christian tradition entirely. I believe he's quoting from somebody like Barosius, who's a pagan philosopher of the 3rd, 4th century BCE. And again, the question is, why Nimrod and why Nebuchadnezzar, his like spiritual son? And all I can find in this connection is a very ancient belief that the Italian elite traced their ancestry to Troy, and that this was embedded in Virgil's Aeneid. And although that was a kind of epic poem, it was taken as a warranty that the Italian elite families actually descended from Troy. So we're now at a kind of murky level of the genealogy of power. Now, the interesting thing is Strabo and the Paschal Chronicle both assert that the descendants of Nimrod lived in Mysia, which is the area in which Troy is situated. But Strabo also says this is the area of the serpent tribe, okay, the Azoitia. So that you have a kind of folding over of the Draconian current as a genealogical factor and the Trojan one. And this would account for the presence of Nimrod there if this was a deep genealogy of power. So the connection, of course, is with the Watchers. And when we're back at that point of intersection between humanity and the divine, in the descent of the angels and the origins of the esoteric arts, because they taught the esoteric arts in return for sexual favors. And it brings to mind a quote of Asclepius. If you don't mind, I'd like to remind you of it if you can't remember it. It talks about what a great miracle man is, Asclepius, being worthy of reverence and honor. He passes into the nature of a god as though he were himself a god. He understands the race of daemons because he originates from the same source. He despises that part of his nature which is only human, for he has put his hope in the divinity of the other part. And of course, this text was one of the key texts that Ficino translated, the Hermetica. So there's a kind of resonance within the Sola Busca to these otherworldly sources of descent and of esoteric power and knowledge.
And that idea also, just going back, of the zero, also that zero card also possibly being the sort of restart of the whole thing after the end, then kind of pulls in some of the ideas of reincarnation or the actual path of the soul. So if you're talking about the relationship of power and genealogies, and then you're also pulling in the idea of reincarnation, then it's like, well, of course, yes, we are descended from this. We are also reincarnated as this, whether you're thinking of it from more the Christian perspective or not, the more pagan perspective, it's still kind of these things constantly recur. Look back, we're the same now. So reinforcing that idea of their power.
That's very clearly shadowed forth in the Sola Busca. There's two cards, number 2 and number 11. And one has a downward pointing torch, the other one has an upward pointing torch. They have complementary colors, and the 2 read as Arabic numerals is 11. And in it, so it points towards 11, and the colors of the 2 figures are complementary. And they have the upward and downward pointing torch. Now, the only place you find this symbolism is in the Mithraic mysteries. And these are the torchbearers, Cortes and Cortopates, who represent respectively the summer solstice and the winter solstice. And the summer solstice, as Porphyry says in the Cave of the Nymphs, is the portal for souls entering incarnation. The winter solstice is in Capricorn, and it's the portal for souls exiting mortal incarnation and for theurgic ascent. So the mechanism of reincarnation is clearly depicted within the Sola Busca. So you're right on with that comment, Joanna. It's quite explicit in the iconography.
I mean, this is fascinating, and I would continue talking about this, but I feel like we should probably I'd like to switch the conversation to what you are both working on right now, what people can expect to see and what you're each excited about that is on your workflow right now.
Please, Christophe.
Okay. Well, I'm working on the Tarot of Marsilio. It's a 3-volume book that I'm publishing with Scarlet Imprint. So after the book we've made with Peter, now I will publish these 3 books, and they sum up the whole of my research. I mean, tens of years of research, so it's heavy. It's going to be 3 heavily illustrated volumes. The first volume will deal with 8 trump cards that correspond to, I would say, the lower level cards. I mean, those who relate the world we live in. The second volume will deal with all the other trumps of the deck. So it's going to be 14 other cards, which are of higher significance. I mean, there will be those I told you about, the authorities, of course, but also the intermediary cards who relate to the way the lower level and the divine level interact. And 2 cards of the highest level, the most probably divine cards of all, which are the world and the butler. I don't remember his name in English. The magician, the magician. And the third volume will be completely dedicated to that passage I told you about in the commentary on the Timaeus. And so it will reinvestigate each and every trump card, but with that grid in mind and knowing the underlying structure, and we'll discuss the astrological resonances of this structure and the cards. So currently I'm finishing this 3rd volume.
So each volume will be published separately, Christophe?
Yeah. Yeah. So separately, yes. One at a time, because it's it will be 3 big chunks to swallow. I mean, one at a time is.
I can imagine.
And that's it.
That's it.
Oh, that's all? I'm sorry.
What's the encore, Christophe?
Oh my goodness.
What's your encore after that?
No, after that, I know what I'm going to do. And I want to subsequently, I would like to write an art of reading the tarot.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
And Peter, what are you up to right now? I know so many things.
Yeah, always. As I mentioned earlier, I just completed a 3-part course on the Egyptian mysteries, addressing them from ethnographic perspective. So it's like the ethnographies of mystery initiation, the ethnography of the invisible, that's to say the esoteric dimensions of ritual practice, and the ethnography of immortalization, which is the actual enactment of union with the deity. So it's in 3 parts, 3 ethnographies, and a lot of original material there. And I hope to be able to deliver that material in Luxor in May, on site, as it were, in the temples. So there'll be an announcement about that later on. Apart from that, I'm writing a book. It's called Cult of Saturn, but it's looking at the cult of Saturn through the lens of Mithraism, which a lot of people don't or haven't seen the connection there. The Mithraism grew out of an Anatolian Orphic tradition, okay, that the iconographies of Mithraism are evidenced in Bronze Age Anatolia, incredibly. And then you do have an overlay of Persian influence in the 6th to 4th centuries, a couple of hundred years. But so there's a complex story here. And through the iconography of Mithraism, I try and draw it together as a narrative to explain how it might have functioned as a mystery, initiatory tradition within the Roman Empire. Okay. So hopefully that will be published by Theon, maybe later this year if I can complete it. It's half done. And apart from that, I'll be working on a text for the Egyptian mysteries, which I think the earliest will be 2025, hopefully with Scarlet Imprint. And I hope to be able to bring the birth sequence, the birth of a deity sequence, which is illustrated in Luxor's temple inner sanctum, shows the pharaoh's mother becoming possessed by Amun and then giving birth to the pharaoh as the son of Amun. Okay, so that's almost unknown because this sequence has not been published before in its entirety. We don't have the epigraphy. We just have bits of it. So hopefully I'll work with the French expedition to Thebes to realize that project. And that will keep me busy for a few more months. Yeah, so I hope we can bring it to fruition in 2025. But there's an awful lot of work required to achieve that, because the state of the walls has deteriorated so badly. And I need high definition imagery of the walls with a color coding and with the epigraphy and the translation, so I can write a commentary around it. So that may well end up as 2 volumes. So essentially the ethnographies of the mysteries and then this particular instantiation. And it's interesting because in this birth process of the 18th and 19th dynasty pharaohs, just on an opposite wall is Alexander the Great undergoing the same ritual process. And so he is a son of Amun. And as you saw from the Sola Busca, the conception of Alexander as the son of Amun is the defining feature of the court cards of the Sola Busca. And the third possession of the operator in the Sola Busca is possession by Amun. So the intent within the Sola Busca is to, so to speak, repeat the acquisition of power that Alexander the Great had for the local ruler. But it's interesting now as I find myself back in that mix, only down in Luxor this time. What a serendipity. Well, there you go.
That is seems very appropriate to how it all works. So
circles within circles within circles.
Well, thank you both so much for your time. I really, really appreciate speaking to both of you, and I can't wait to speak to both of you separately again for another one of your projects. That would be really wonderful, and I'm sure everyone listening has really appreciated this as much as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joanne. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Stars overhead, don't you dare guide me back to my bed. The river is frozen, the pollen path's bare. Don't wait for me, darling.